So, hi, welcome to the Thursday, June 2nd, 2022 meeting of the Kubernetes VMware User Group, where we talk about all things related to users sharing ideas for best practices and even discussing issues related to running all forms of Kubernetes on VMware infrastructure. At today's meeting, I put a line item in the agenda of just a really brief recap of what happened at KubeCon Europe. I know some of us were actually there, so apologies if I'm rehashing stuff you already are aware of, but there are others who I suspect were unable to attend. And then we have an audience on YouTube that perhaps was unable to attend. And it shouldn't take long. Then our usual practice is that anybody who attends here is welcome to put anything they want in that agenda. You have to join the group first to get edit rights to the agenda notes document. And by the way, let me paste a link to that notes document in the chat right now. If you're a first timer and you don't even know where that lives. 1 minute here. But anyway, if you join the group, then you get edit rights by virtue of being logged into the Google system under the same account you used to join the group. And you're welcome to put items on that agenda. If you do it well in advance, say 2 weeks, I'm happy to take that as a mission to go try to even recruit speakers. So, I don't really relish trying to be the speaker and I'm not the authority on all subjects in all areas. But if you give me some lead time, I can usually track down speakers on whatever you're interested in related to Kubernetes running on vSphere. We've brought in people involved with storage, with disaster recovery backup, all kinds of topics. And given enough lead time, I can usually be successful at bringing in people. The other thing is if we run out of agenda, we don't automatically kill the meeting. Sometimes we might shorten it, but we just turn it into open-ended birds of a feather discussion. Whatever you're curious about, want to discuss, we'll go for it. And sometimes those turn out to be the best meetings, even though they were completely unplanned. You never know what's going to happen in these discussions, and sometimes they've turned out to be really interesting. So with that said, let me share my screen and so I think if someone can confirm that you can see a slide being rendered.
Yep, we're good.
Okay, so this was the presentation that was done by myself and Michael Gash at KubeCon Europe. And I'm just going to give you a taste of this. And in the agenda notes document, I published a link to the video recording that's just went up on YouTube this morning, as well as the deck, so you can learn more. But the idea here about this presentation is that when you run Kubernetes on top of vSphere, there's actually a number of abstraction layers involved here that can and do have metrics and interesting things going on. And in some circumstances, particularly when you get failures at different levels of this abstraction hierarchy, it can be advantageous to be fully aware of what's going on. Maybe if you get advance notice, you can adjust things so that there's no impact at all. Or maybe if things malfunction, you at least have an understanding of root cause. So it turns out that there is this system of what's called a Viva appliance that is built on open source technology that hooks into these different abstraction layers and produces events. These are called cloud events. And the cloud events itself is a CNCF administered specification for publishing events in a common form. The CNCF also publishes software in the form of the Knative project. It's called Knative Eventing. And this allows you to both produce and consume these events in useful ways. And the scenario here is that the vSphere platform already is producing well in excess of 1,000 of these events, to give notices of things going on. Some of these can be related to security issues like failed logins, others to issues like, I don't know, a failed DRAM chip in a compute server. Historically, these were put in place for things like, pager duty notifications back in the old world, but they still live on today. I think the actual number is a little over 1,700 of them that are built into the product, but don't quote me on that figure, and it's always growing. On top of vSphere itself, if you're using third-party storage, often the storage arrays will produce events or have an API that can be used to, with a little bit of a wrapper, to produce events. Things like load balancers, firewalls typically have, once again, they might be for legacy pager notification, but it's very likely that all the way to the bottom levels of your hardware-based infrastructure, you have systems that are capable and are producing events. vSphere can do it. Some applications can even do it. And the reason that this is useful is that it's possible to build a system that puts all of these on something like a message bus, and the event system built into Knative and Cloud Events doesn't even lock you into one. You could conceivably use anything from low-end MQTT to RabbitMQ to pretty much all the popular ones are capable potentially of being a party line thing where people can publish and subscribe to events and share them across your organization. And one of the cool things about these events is they're very loosely coupled. So they don't even lock you into a particular language for consuming these events. If you want to react to something going wrong and turn it into some kind of an audit log or an email notification or even a Slack message, which is what Michael demoed, you can pretty much do it in all the popular languages. PowerShell, I think, is common amongst typical vSphere users, but I think you could, if you prefer to write your code in Python or some other platform, since it's an open thing with plenty of examples for all of these, you're not locked into any particular one. The other thing that was called out in this presentation as an advantage of this event is that even though many of these things have APIs that allow you to subscribe to things that are going on, in some of these low-level things, they anticipated that almost the API creds would be combined to somebody with almost root-level authority, and they're read-write things. But with this event notification system, you can put in place a service that gets the events from an API and turns them into a one-way read-only thing that maybe filters them too, so that only events relative to a certain area or a certain department of your company or whatever end up being exposed. So you have granular control potentially over who can use these, who can see them, etc. And sometimes that's a very useful feature that isn't available in whatever APIs might be there. So the bottom line summary of this is that by using this, I compare this to the model of you have two choices in life. You can ignore all these things going on below the level you're operating at, or you can be, you can have systemic situational awareness of all things from top to bottom. And that gives you the potential to be more like the commercial airline pilot, where We've all had the experience of flying in a plane. The announcement comes over the public address system saying, put your seatbelts on in about 20 minutes. We're expecting a little turbulence. And that only comes about because that pilot is getting weather reports about an area he's about to fly into and kind of an advance warning. These event systems can give you these kind of equivalents of that advance notice so that the passengers in your platform have that airline-like experience of no unexpected surprises. You can re-steer the aircraft to even avoid things that are really bad, versus the alternative of being captain of the Titanic, where your ship has had a gaping hole ripped in it below the waterline. You're going to sink, but you're oblivious. You think that in the beginning, you think nothing's wrong, and the act of the ship going down is a huge surprise to you. You take your choice. So anyway, that's the gist of that presentation. So let me share the links. Oops. So if you open the agenda notes doc that I posted in chat, this is the link to the YouTube recording. And below that, this is the link to the actual deck. So that covers what's in the agenda now. And at this point, I'm going to throw it open for open discussion. Should anybody want to discuss whatever it is you want to discuss? And maybe David and Michael, since you were at KubeCon, if I left out anything interesting that you came across related to Kubernetes and vSphere, certainly, I don't mean to monopolize this, but I think maybe there were a few other things that went on. We did have, this is more social in nature, but we did have a physical face-to-face meeting of some of the users at a dinner, and I'm hoping to maybe repeat that experience at KubeCon North America when it comes around in October.
Yeah, no, I don't think I had much to add. I mean, I attended a couple of mini cube sessions, or sorry, mini cube sessions, which was very interesting. They're adding support for oh gosh, I'm blanking on it, but yeah, it was, other than that, like, yeah, that's probably like my highlight, what I've seen at KubeCon.
Yeah, that sounds kind of curious. Was
it
it related to vSphere at all? I know Minikube has vSphere drivers, and certainly they have, I think the more common one, I've never used Minikube on vSphere, but I've used it on Workstation and Fusion.
Yeah, I forgot. I think it was, they were adding support for shoot. Dude, what was it? I really want to make sure I got it right.
Was it like ARM or something?
Yeah, I think it was ARM, but it was also it was something else. It was I'm probably missing it now. But yeah, I think they added ARM support was one.
That's cool.
There's something else too, but yeah, it's totally, I'm blanking on it now.
So I know like a number of things I've heard, like whispers of like using like a smaller ARM machine to be like a vSAN witness, something like that. Like that sounds kind of cool if that's like a capability. I know that I've heard or read William Lamb talk about some of that stuff.
That sounds like it would be really useful because, that witness thing is almost sort of like a throwaway where probably minimal requirement for resource, but you do have to have one. So if you could use something really cheap and physically small, that would be super useful.
Yeah, it'd be like edge cases, but like instead of having a virtual machine, which could go down with like the host that it's on, you would have like an ARM machine that's the witness.
Yeah. And I think they do have I think it's a Fling, but they do have the ARM-based ESXi. So
Yeah.
uh, maybe you could just use one of those. Yeah, the reason I was looking at Minikube is that, typically Minikube is not deemed worthy of production use cases, although at edge, where, you do have constrained resource, that could, the world is quite different. So maybe it is viable for that. And I've been looking at, and in fact, in another session at KubeCon, I did a demo of bringing up Kubernetes in kind on an edge device that only had 8 gig of RAM. And one of the issues with kind is it's sort of sandboxed inside Docker for network purposes. So it takes more than a little bit of work to expose a service you've got running inside kind to like an outside network interface. And I think Minikube might be a little better in that regard in terms of flexibility. It's closer to a regular, if you'll, maybe it's an abuse of the term regular, but it's closer to a regular Kubernetes node that you might deploy on bare metal or in a VM than something that is living inside. If you run your Kubernetes in kind, you've added like another abstraction layer where you've got the outer host supporting the Docker runtime, and only inside the Docker runtime is your Kubernetes cluster. And I think in Minikube, you've sort of removed one layer of abstraction that you have to deal with to get to the outside world.
I'd be curious how because I know they use kind for like the bootstrapper for TKGM management clusters when you first deploy it. So I'd be curious, like if that was like an issue that they had to deal with.
Well, usually those bootstraps are just sort of temporary in nature.
Yeah.
So, and they have one job to do, and then often they're powered off. So the fact that you can't get to the outside, you actually can effectively get to the internet to download things. You just can't expose something like a Kubernetes service. And in some ways, for that use case, that's a feature, that you've reduced your threat model, because you don't really have any scenario with that bootstrap where you want the outside world reaching into you. Yeah. If you can get out, you're fine, but you don't really want people coming at you. Yet in these edge use cases, it all depends on the edge use case. Some of them, all IO over IP networks are originated by you, in which case maybe kind is just fine. But if it's a scenario where I want to host a web server or a web service or something that other people in my location out at edge want to establish connectivity to, then you need something, and the traditional Kubernetes in a data center would be to deploy a load balancer and ingress. And you can do those things inside kind, but really all you've accomplished in a default employment by running the load balancer and the ingress is potentially exposing it to the host, not to the outside network. And I think with Minikube, maybe that's different, but I haven't gotten to the point to prove that to myself yet.
Yeah, I'd be interested because like in the beginning with like bootstrapping cluster or environments that were like air gapped, it was probably like the biggest number one issue with customers trying to like just try TKGM. And I even remember like an internal VeloCloud team having a similar problem with like their bootstrap VM was in one data center, and the other data center where the vCenter was to deploy the management cluster was like across in like the UK, and they were in New York. And like the response back from the vCenter was causing like all sorts of crazy problems with the deployment of the management cluster.
Yeah, a lot of times, well, Edge often has really lousy networking too, in the sense that it's subject to going out altogether. It has high latency, low bandwidth. So yeah, there's a lot of challenges there. And Kubernetes itself, I think a lot of rookie users aren't even aware of some of the implicit assumptions that go into latencies between different components, like you can't have an infinite latency between, say, your worker nodes in the control plane and expect to have things work real well. And, you know, it's kind of interesting that some of these problems happen even in data centers if you try to cross wide geo regions.
Mhm.
But when you get to edge, they might even be in the same metro area, but still trying to do their links over radio networks and things that are not 100% reliable. So I think that this is sort of like trying to run on a finished racetrack versus an obstacle course sometimes when you
Mhm.
go out to edge. And people are still trying to figure out how to deal with some of the challenges.
Yeah, I mean, it would be cool to even see like a bootstrap cluster. I keep on coming back to this because it's the only thing I'm familiar with, but like a bootstrap cluster on an edge device, it's like an ARM device, like with mini keyboard kind. And
Yeah,
that would be awesome to see, even like if that wasn't something that you guys talked about in the session.
yeah. This was actually, just by sheer coincidence, I'm co-chair of this VMware user group, but I'm also tech lead of what's called the Kubernetes IoT Edge working group. So that's nothing to do with VMware. That's just Edge in general. So we had a session at KubeCon talking about what was called secure device onboard, where you deal with the challenge of bringing up a Kubernetes node in this case at a location that has no trained or even trusted people at it. So there are some of these edge scenarios where, I don't know, like an offshore oil platform that literally they're unattended, and others where, perhaps a retail store, you might have some people, but they have zero IT skills, and maybe they're not even trusted that much in that you don't want to give them even login credentials to anything. And yet you want to have a scenario where you could FedEx or DHL a system to this location, have somebody there, open the box, hook up power and maybe a network cable and just turn it on, and the thing self-installs and is remote manageable. And I'm not saying all the problems are currently solved in that area, but there's a lot of activity going on. And it certainly is at the point at a minimum of, people getting proof of concepts working, if it isn't going into full production yet. And some of the interesting things being discussed, although I don't think they're in widespread use, but we had a chat in the hallway track at KubeCon over some of these ideas. One being that as part of a bootstrap, you could, in addition to having that person out at edge who hooked up the power and the network cable, plug in a USB key that would be used to bootstrap to kind of cut the bandwidth demands of your initial install, where you might be pulling tons of large binaries. And, an initial reaction that's perfectly fair is, how do I trust this? Sending a USB key inherently seems to have risks, but perhaps you could alleviate them by putting a file on there that's cryptographically signed and encrypted, so that something in the device can establish the provenance of this blob, that it's trustworthy and came from the source it's supposed to, decompress it and install it, and cut back on a lot of that. Some of that network traffic during the initial onboarding is typically when you're going to take a massive hit that, on a slow network could take days. And that might be a workaround to that issue. Now, I don't know that it's viable long-term, for your day two operations and things for doing your updates, but at least bootstrapping the thing up, it would give you a fighting chance. Another thing similar to that, that maybe is more secure, maybe not. One of the issues with USB is that a lot of unattended edge locations, people intentionally block or even buy devices with no USB ports, because that's a serious threat model. There's all kinds of devices with, that emulate keyboards and things that can come in there and cause havoc. If you've got an OS that sort of auto installs drivers when things get plugged into a USB port. But another one that we discussed in the hallway was shipping almost like a burner cell phone with Wi-Fi or Bluetooth so that the device could bond to it. And you maybe could almost do something like run a Harbor container image registry or some other container image registry temporarily on a cell phone that is right next to the device to use it as an aid in the bootstrap process. And then when it's over, ship the thing back, or if it was one of these really cheap cell phones, even dispose of it. You got the same issue with the USB where you need some kind of authentication of it and things. And but I think that those would probably be solvable problems.
Yeah, I mean, we've seen like with the air gap deployments, usually someone just like in kind spins up their own Harbor registry with all the images loaded on it.
Uh-huh.
So like you could almost do that with like a separate device.
Yeah, and
Like you
even
said.
in the vSphere world, I know William Lamb published that fling of an appliance that even hosts OVAs and for VM images. And I believe the latest incarnation might even have a container image registry in it. So if you've got a vSphere out there, it's probably even viable to install that as a VM. But an external box, which could be as little as a cell phone, I think could do that too. Like,
It's an interesting thought process if like it was like a device that you like if you're deploying multiple edge locations, you bring it out, it has the registry with the newest images on it, and then you take that home with you when you go back and then go to another site after you've like updated the images or something like that and just bring the box with you.
yeah. Another one for the day too. This is just, I'm brainstorming and this thought just occurred to me as we're making this discussion. But a lot of these edge scenarios are things like retail stores that, where the company operating them has trucks that visit these, once a day, once a week or whatever. I almost wonder if you couldn't do something like put like a Wi-Fi node on your truck that's going to go there once a day or once a week. It could be an industrial computer with Wi-Fi, or once again, even a cell phone. And these retail locations are capable of spotting when the truck is there and opportunistically doing an update. So effectively, they might be air gapped, in the sense of no internet connectivity. But if the truck comes by periodically, they could use that as an opportunity to get updates even on profiles in the device, updates on the software running there. And I don't see why that wouldn't work, although I've never heard of anybody trying that.
Yeah, I heard too, like a lot of like telcos with like their cell towers, they utilize some like air gapped kind of installation. I don't know if they'd have like ESXi hosts or whatever, but like I wonder how they go through that same process. Like, do they just send somebody up there all the way up to the cell tower with like a device and connect in? Or I guess it's a cell tower. Maybe it's connected kind of, but not really.
Yeah, no, it has to be connected to at least their, the cell towers go to a land backbone, I believe, that they're not like fully mesh networks. I believe that they run, a wired pipe down to the ground to use terrestrial wiring as kind of the point-to-point links between the cell towers. But I could be wrong. I'm not an expert on that. We do have a few members of this group who work for cell companies, but unfortunately none of them are here today. But maybe in the future we could ask them how that works.
Yeah, that'd be interesting.
There is an opposite polarity that's somewhat like this idea of, the truck visiting a retail location, in that I have heard of an open source project being done by a company to support automakers. And that would use, in modern cars, they can easily have 20 or 30 computers inside the vehicle, each with firmware, talking on things like CAN bus. And they can and do require updates. I think I've had the experience with my own cars where, firmware updates come out on things, anything from the entertainment system to potentially things like engine controls, anti-lock brakes, etc. And the legacy scenario there is that somebody would have to be notified of a recall, come into the dealership where they'd plug in a cable and perform an update. And that process is cumbersome enough that a lot of vehicles stay out there not updated. So they're typically only heavily subscribed to when it's a serious safety issue, and more or less they badger somebody into getting the update. But some of the other classes of updates, like entertainment systems, maybe the customer is oblivious to the fact that it's even available. They wanted this scenario where you could even potentially do a drive-by update where they give you a notice, hey, we've got a station set up at our dealerships, so drive into the parking lot. You don't need an appointment. You could even drive in the middle of the night when it's closed and drive there and park it for 20 minutes. And I don't know that system is in production, but it seemed to make a lot of sense. And it's sort of the inverse of the truck route going out to the edge locations. It's sort of bring the edge locations in if they're mobile. But, the world is becoming interesting with some of the opportunities that are being put out there with, radio links in addition to wired links everywhere. Maybe we're getting way off topic here because some of this I don't think is all that related to vSphere. You could sort of apply these on everything, but given that vSphere aligns with on-prem, and this is sort of like on-prem Kubernetes as opposed to running Kubernetes exclusively in large public clouds, I guess I will declare it relevant to this group's subject matter.
Yeah, it's better than nothing, I guess. Like, it's good to have a talk about, even if it was semi-related.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think certainly a lot of the people who come to this VMware meeting really are, they're definitely on-prem use cases. And, so things that fall in that realm of Kubernetes plus on-prem, I think are going to tend to be of interest. So I see Bryson is joining us. So for those of you who haven't met him, he's one of the sponsors of this group.
Hey guys.
Hi.
Sorry, I had an issue going on. So
yeah, we started by going over a recap of what went on at KubeCon Europe. And in the agenda notes doc, it turns out they just posted the recording of that session. And I posted a link to the deck as well. So you might be interested in that. It was a demo of using the Viva open source event platform to monitor events being generated by the different levels of your stack, not just Kubernetes, but going down into vSphere. This wasn't demoed, but we made the point potentially of you may have hardware devices that have APIs or already generate events that were maybe originally intended for things like PagerDuty, but these can typically be converted into these what they call cloud events, a CNCF spec for a uniform format for publishing events. And then you can put together systems that subscribe to all of these notices and maybe react to them. Maybe the reaction is, steering away from a failure point, or maybe it's just being aware that this is happening so that you have time to avoid a little turbulence and take preemptive measures before they knock you off the air. And I think you might be interested in spending a few minutes to go look at that, either the deck or the recording.
That was on my list to look at. Remind me how it's spelled.
VEBA is VEBA. Here, let me, I'll reshare.
Did we do a meeting on this? I
We
know it
did
came
about
up-
a year ago. So this was updated. So
Okay.
about a year ago, Michael Gash and William Lamb did a presentation on it. And at that time, it was just sort of this fling that falls under VMware only, kind of unsupported, but they've open sourced it. And they even have community meetings on it. So it's getting a fair amount of traction to where they have users of it showing up for, I don't remember if their meetings are monthly or every 2 weeks, but it actually gained enough popularity that they have meetings running on this. Here, let me reshare my screen. Okay, I assume you can see that now. So that's just the agenda notes doc. But if you go to these two links, you can get the deck and the recording. And then I know since the chat postings drop off, let me repost the link to the agenda notes document in the Zoom chat, and you can go grab those links without having to copy them from a screen capture.
All right, cool, thanks.
And then we morphed into a discussion just during Birds of a Feather talk about different challenges with deploying Kubernetes, not just on-prem, but at edge. And we've been having an interesting discussion of how you deal with the intermittent network connectivity and things like onboarding when you're challenged with maybe, when you onboard a new location, you have typically a challenge of that entailing a lot of big binary downloads and things to get the node started. And I mentioned to this group that I, just by coincidence, happened to be affiliated with the Kubernetes IoT Edge working group, as well as this group. And we had a presentation at KubeCon on secure device onboard, which is a mechanism made maybe for something smaller than something as big as a Walmart store, but even like an offshore oil platform or a really tiny shop that has no trained IT people, maybe no trusted employees, where you want to just FedEx a hardware device to a location. You have somebody there who's capable of plugging it in and maybe plugging in a network cable and pushing the power button, but you don't even give them login credentials. And you want a scenario where that thing can come on board, install itself, and come up into a remotely managed Kubernetes cluster. Maybe a single node cluster if it's a super low resource device. And in that IoT Edge session, I demoed that, bringing up a single node Kubernetes on a edge device, really tiny one, a Dell Edge Gateway that had a few CPU cores and 8 gig of RAM. Now you couldn't run much on that, but it did do a self-initiated Kubernetes cluster install, taking about 25 minutes. Now it did suck up a fair amount of internet bandwidth, but we were talking about workarounds to that, where potentially to alleviate some of that bandwidth consumption, you could possibly do things like plug in a USB key, a flash drive that had a file that was encrypted and cryptographically signed, so you could establish provenance and use that as part of your bootstrap process to maybe get access to some of the large binary blobs for that initial startup. We also kicked around the idea that you could maybe even ship call it a burner cell phone with this, where the device could temporarily bond to a cell phone or other device that could host over Wi-Fi or maybe Bluetooth an image registry or something that would use during the boot up process. And we also kicked around the idea that some people might already have truck fleets making periodic stops at these locations so that you could host a Wi-Fi point that isn't permanently visible to these locations. But if that visited the site once a day or once a week, they could do rolling upgrades to even cover day 2 operations without requiring a lot of public internet access. It's almost like you could argue that this is somewhat like air gapped, where if you had truck rolls that were periodic to these sites, why couldn't you put in place a private network that would let you do high latency update? None. And if you don't have a lot of bandwidth to the public internet, and maybe that creates security risks of even opening up that kind of port, this might be something interesting to consider. So for those of you who don't know why I'm going into all this with Bryson, he's affiliated with Walmart. So I was just thinking this might be something interesting to him.
Yeah, we've had to deal with a lot of that. It ended up being you throttle that traffic so that you can still have other things run.
Mm-hmm.
But then it just means everything takes forever to pull down.
Uh-huh.
So really that comes down to if you're deploying things out there, because it's not just building the cluster, it's deploying your apps.
Yeah.
You deploy them out there and they don't have their image out there yet. They sit there and image pull back off forever, pulling down the image. So it ends up being like a strategy of, hey, we're going to deploy, so we're going to push our image down first. Then when we actually turn on the app, it's ready to roll. And we do something like you mentioned, we have a local registry cache that will cache it so that if it's pulled already, it doesn't matter what node it's on, it pulls through that cache and pulls quickly once it's down there.
Yeah, I think you kind of have to do that, because the other scenario with these images is sometimes, in fact, I think more often than not, when you trigger an update, it's not one image, it's a bunch of them. So that if you don't want to pull the trigger on doing that, only to find that you've got an kind of an update of an N tier system that needs 2 or 3 images to work right, and find you only have a couple instead of all 3, and end up in a sort of a mess.
Yeah, and on Edge, you have to be prepared to not have network connectivity.
Right.
So if you don't have network connectivity and you want everything to keep running without the internet, then you need to be able to have your apps move to a different node and be able to pull the images to that node without having to go out to the internet. So that's why one of the reasons having that local cache, or I mean, even if you don't want to have a local cache, having something in place that syncs the images between the nodes so that they were already on the node, you could do something like that too. But yeah, just building the cluster is only the one aspect on the edge. You have to, like, at any time you could not have network because they cut the phone line, or
Right.
on what you're doing.
Yeah, and I think anything that's a success business wise, at the end of the day, over the course of the years it's likely to be in service, that initial onboard is just a small part of, ultimately your investment is sort of in the day 2 thing of keeping that thing updated and maintained over time without having to do truck rolls and visits subsequently. So anyway, we're just in free form discussion here, Bryson. So if you had anything you wanted to bring up, and I invited people to nominate topics. I've got one more thing, but I'll hold off on it to see if any users want to bring up any things to discuss or that they've encountered or want to ask about recently.
I haven't looked at the cluster API status for VMware recently. What's the, I know, I mean, have there been any big improvements on that lately?
You know, I know there are updates, but I'm the wrong person to ask for a detailed report. I can go find out for you, but a lot of the things I'm dealing with are through a distribution that uses cluster API to do the install, but sort of hides it from me, so that I'm not aware of that. The recent activities on other things related, like say the cloud provider, are that I think that the vSphere cloud provider has moved forward with dual stack support, meaning IPv4 with v6, kind of like Kubernetes in general. So that if you had occasion to use IPv6 and IPv4, there have been improvements in that area. And I think that there are also recent CSI improvements for storage related to supporting snapshotted things for, I think it comes into play more when you're trying to do backup of stateful apps that would be running under Kubernetes on top of vSphere. In terms of cluster API, other than supporting newer versions of vSphere, I can't say that I've heard of anything that came out recently. Is there something in particular you were looking for?
No, I've been a while since I looked at it. I'm just gonna start looking at it again.
Mm-hmm.
It can be interesting because a lot of the like backend engineers for TKG and other Tanzu products are like contributors to cluster API. It'd be interesting to hear like something from them if they had any cool new features or like different, even like at a lower level of like even going through what is cluster API if there are people who don't know. Might be a good like future topic, I guess.
So yeah, and what, to your point about Edge, like one of the things that I think we held off on doing some stuff like that before was because of the Edge, like having all those, having that some of the things that are required early on, we had to have it at the Edge. So I need to look at it a little bit more, but some of those images and keeping those images up to date and things like that.
Yeah. So for those, if there is anybody on the call who hasn't even heard of Cluster API, it's a system to manage your underlying infrastructure itself through vSphere. So there's a number of Cluster API providers. It's designed so I could deploy Kubernetes to AWS, to vSphere, to bare metal, and there are implementation. Cluster API itself is more or less a spec, and then there are implementations for these different underlying platforms. And the idea is that you come up with a manifest for what you want your infrastructure to look like, pull the trigger and through the Kubernetes API, and things that operate in these implementations just make it happen. So in vSphere, the cluster API for vSphere would compose virtual machines that become Kubernetes cluster nodes. And likewise in Amazon, VMs would be deployed that would be your Kubernetes cluster nodes. There's a couple implementations for that I think would arguably be suitable for Edge. One that VMware is working on, and I'm not so sure. David, do you know how much of this is currently available in public versus still in-house only?
What are you referring to?
You know, our cluster API project for bring your own host. I don't want to violate some rule of communicating something I'm aware of that isn't actually public. So I'm going to be a little cautious of saying more on that, but it exists.
Yeah, I'm not sure about the bring your own host stuff. I definitely am a little closer to the other providers like Kappa and CapP, but
and there's another one that got a lot of the maintainers are with Equinix, but it's called Tinkerbell is kind of the unofficial name of it, but it's a way to deploy clusters to, I'm going to say bare metal hosts, but I think since Equinix is behind it in their, it put I don't know what category Equinix is, but they have data centers that you can buy services from. And I think it does deploy to VMs. And that one is most definitely public. And there have been presentations on that. There was a good one at the Cloud Native Rejects conference, North America last year by Dan Finneran that I think should be available up on YouTube. And that's a way to deploy using Kubernetes clusters to bare metal. But there are a few implementations of it out there. I think you'd have to be either a really large user that is effectively going to take on the job of installing Kubernetes itself, Kubernetes yourself, or you'd be a distribution provider that would, as part of your distro, consume cluster API and package it into a commercial offering that for a smallish end user of Kubernetes, boy, it strikes me that, going to cluster API and deploying your own clusters yourself is maybe something you'd prefer to outsource to a vendor because there's a fair amount of work there to keeping tabs on it and running it. So we're nearing time and the time limit for this meeting, but one other topic I wanted to bring up is that this user group is operating under the Kubernetes project, and the Kubernetes steering committee has made the observation that they originally anticipated a bunch of these user groups divided up by cloud provider, like they'd have one for AWS users, one for Azure users, et cetera. But no other group has actually applied for a charter and gone into operation, and that we're the only one out there, and that we're often covering things that go beyond just Kubernetes. For example, we've had a lot of talk on load balancers and things that technically aren't Kubernetes itself. And they've been making suggestions that perhaps this group is better hosted over in the generic CNCF rather than the Kubernetes project itself, because we're kind of going beyond the boundaries of Kubernetes and what gets talked about here. And we're likely to try to put on a presentation, a birds of a feather thing for users at KubeCon North America that would discuss this concept of how can the CNCF better serve the user base, so that users have forums to get out of it. And it's broader in scope than just a group like this, which is kind of worldwide in scope, meets on Zoom. But also during COVID, there was at one time a pretty healthy infrastructure of physical meetups, in major metropolitan areas where users would get together and share ideas face to face. In Los Angeles, it got so big that I think the peak meeting of one of the Los Angeles Kubernetes meetup groups drew 250 people. And it got popular enough in Los Angeles that it actually forked into a group operating predominantly on the west side of Los Angeles and another sort of closer to downtown. And like I say, those just completely died with COVID, but there's an aspirational goal of trying to bring those back, maybe under some kind of a formal structure that would serve as a means to recruit speakers to these groups and keep them running on a healthy basis. Anyway, I'm planning on submitting a CFP for KubeCon North America to just be a birds of a feather discussion for users on, maybe bringing in some of the CNCF people on how can you better be served as a user, or maybe if you're with a service organization, you're effectively a representative of users, and build up this infrastructure. one of the things being talked about is to maybe change the scope of this particular group. I think this might lift and shift over to the CNCF from the Kubernetes project, but we might also simply declare this. One idea is that this be declared an on-prem Kubernetes group as opposed to a VMware Kubernetes group. If you're running on VMware, you're certainly on-prem, but there are other forms of on-prem other than vSphere, and it would broaden this to be not so VMware specific. But maybe we bring in other voices that are not with VMware, but who are experts in the field of running Kubernetes on-prem. So I just wanted to let everybody know that this is in the planning at this stages. And if I get one of these birds of a feather sessions accepted for this KubeCon conference, I certainly welcome anybody on this call to go in there and vigorously participate in that session, maybe even help me run it. If people have experience either as users with opinions on what they would hope to get out of a user group infrastructure, or even experience running local meetup groups or attending local meetup groups, all voices welcome. And with that said, I think we've got 2 minutes left. So last call for anything anybody else wants to drop out there. And if there isn't time, you're welcome to continue this conversation on our Slack channel. Okay, I'll take silence as nobody with a last item. So thanks everybody for attending, and we'll see you at the next one in a month. Although I haven't looked to see if that conflicts with the US 4th of July holiday, in which case maybe I won't be attending, and I'll have to see if Miles Gray, who is the other co-chair, would be interested in hosting that, or perhaps we'll end up canceling the meeting on first Thursday of July, depending on how that looks from the calendar perspective. So once again, bye everybody. Nice chatting.
Right.